All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I know these are unusual times we're in, but I'm excited that you all can be here with us. I thank you for your patience with NCIT and everyone else as we work through these new technical challenges and all the fun things we get to experience through these COVID-19 times. I know transportation is essential, so I'm glad we're all able to work together to keep things moving. But I hope everyone's families, friends are all staying safe and well during these times as well. First thing I want to do as far as introduction say, I'd like everyone to answer the poll that's up in the WebEx. So if you don't see the poll, somewhere on your WebEx screen, you should see 3 dots. And from there, you hit the dots and you should see a polling option. We have a question out there. I'm just curious to see what people think. The question there is, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, traffic patterns and volumes have been atypical. How long do you think it will be until traffic returns to normal? Or maybe it's a new normal. So there's some different options there. If you can find the poll, I'd appreciate people throwing a response in there. With so many people on the call, we're not going to do formal introductions, and it would probably take us 40 minutes and be very chaotic. So I hope everyone can get a chance to answer the poll, and I'll share the results at the end of my announcements. All right. Next up, I want to thank Kimley Horn. They are our gold advertiser for today's meeting. Hopefully you can see Kimley Horn's slides playing on the WebEx here. Every section meeting, we have a gold advertiser, and Kimley Horn has been gracious enough to support NCIT and be the advertiser for this meeting. Normally they get to give away some swag, but in these current times, that's not going to work out. So we thank them for being flexible and still putting on this presentation. Some announcements. The NCITE Summer Social will still be happening this year. We're in the process of planning an event that could take place either over webinar or in person. I think, due to the size of our group, it's probably looking like it will be a webinar type event, but we want it to be interactive. So some type of game or trivia or something like that we can do for fun this summer. If by chance the timing works out and we can get back together, that's something we'll look into doing. Maybe we could go do the trivia or the game at a brewery or something like that. But more to come on that. The Midwest IT annual meeting that was scheduled for early this summer has been canceled. I'm guessing most of you are aware of that. However, Tyler Craig from our section is helping organize a virtual Mighty Race. And for those of you that haven't done one before, a Mighty Race is kind of a scavenger hunt, I'll say, across a town, and normally it's kind of a foot race. Imagine Amazing Race TV show, but we're going to try to do it virtually this year. So stay tuned for more information on that. The IT annual meeting, you should have just got an email about that as well, that the IT annual meeting is now going to be a virtual meeting. That was supposed to take place in August in New Orleans, but due to the COVID-19, they're changing that to be virtual. And I believe it's going to be, it's not just going to be like a one-time thing, like a typical meeting. They're going to offer it for a number of weeks. So stay tuned for more information from that on ITE. Other announcements, we're looking to form a community outreach / STEM committee for NCITE. We already do some community outreach and STEM events, but we want to see what else we can do. So if you have interest in helping out with that community outreach, STEM, whatever you want to call it, committee, feel free to reach out to myself or any of the board members, and we will kind of start putting a list together and see what we can do. Final announcement is keep an eye on NCITE social media. We're trying to continue to use that, especially during these times when we can't be together as much. I know recently Tyler posted a May Madness poll, and that is a fundraiser we're doing, but it's kind of in March Madness bracket style for different, I think, bike and pedestrian treatments or applications. So it's kind of a fun way to raise some money, compete with a little tournament. So check out the NCITE social media for that. Before I turn it over to Morgan, I see the poll results are in here. It looks like people are thinking that traffic will return to normal. A lot of different answers. Could be the winter, could be next spring, could be later. And I think that's interesting because that's kind of what I'm hearing now too. There's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think we know yet for sure what the new normal is. I've heard everything from a lot of people are going to start teleworking to there might be less things like carpools because people are concerned about COVID-19. I've heard all kinds of speculation. So I think it's just something interesting to look at and keep our eyes on as we move forward as transportation professionals. With that, I will turn it over to our director, Morgan Hoxie, who is going to introduce today's technical presentation.
Thank you, Jake. And Randy, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, I stopped sharing mine, so you're good to go. Today, I'd like to introduce Ethan and Randy, who will be presenting at our meeting this afternoon. Ethan Hawley is the Vision Zero Program Coordinator for the City of Minneapolis, working to eliminate traffic deaths and severe injuries. Ethan was involved in many aspects of Minneapolis' speed limit change, including the legislative process, evaluation, and education efforts. Randy is the city traffic engineer for the City of St. Paul and has 25 years of experience in transportation engineering, traffic engineering, roadway design, and project management. In his role with the city, Randy leads the city's traffic engineering division, which is responsible for all traffic engineering design functions, traffic signal operations, and parking management. Please help me in welcoming Ethan and Randy.
All right. So I can get started here. I can just maybe a thumbs up that people can hear me. Thanks, Nick.
We can hear you.
First off, thanks for having us. Both Ethan and I are excited to be here, share our experience here over the last year and work in our speed limit evaluation. And now both cities are well into implementation. I would share this is a very interesting way to do a presentation. NCITE is a group that's near and dear to my heart, and when I go there, it's a little sad to do a presentation like this and not be able to see all the people that I know well that are a part of this, and not be able to actually see and greet you all in person. So know that I saw a lot of your names out there, and I wish I had the opportunity to just talk in person, but obviously that's not possible in these times. So again, Ethan and I are excited to share our experiences here. A tag team with this presentation. I realized that we didn't really have a slide here in terms of what our agenda is, but going to give a little bit of background on why speed matters, a summary of our legislative and policy work, kind of go through what our technical evaluation was, and then finish with our implementation. So kind of the first part of this here is just the background on why speed matters. The first thing here is just a slide on our modal hierarchy. This is something that both Minneapolis and St. Paul have adopted in regards to putting pedestrians first, followed by bicyclists, transit, and other vehicles. And a key part of this is the focus on safety we put on our most vulnerable users. The second thing is the real tie between speed and safety. This graphic here just shows how much more vulnerable our pedestrians are when speeds are higher. This graphic shows that 20 miles an hour, the risk of a serious accident is fairly low, but you double that speed to 40 miles an hour and it's significantly higher. The other element where speed and safety come together is really our stop and sight distances. Higher speeds, it takes longer to stop. This is particularly important in our urban environment where our sight lines and other things going on in our corridors often make extended sight lines challenging. And then here, I think both Minneapolis and St. Paul have a number of policy documents that speak towards prioritizing of our vulnerable users, designing for those users, as well as dealing with, just a second, the fun part of having too many devices. I'm just going to start over here, but again, the different policy documents that we have that speak to, again, looking at ways to protect our vulnerable users, work towards Vision Zero policies. Minneapolis actually just kicked off their Vision Zero program. And these are, again, steeped in a number of documents. For us, it's our comprehensive plan. We recently completed a pedestrian plan. Our street design manual speaks to all these things, and in many cases actually identifies reducing speed as a priority. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan for a few slides.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. So I'm going to provide a little bit of the context from Minneapolis's perspective and talk through some of the legislative history as well. So broadly, for Minneapolis, our work on speed limits began with our adoption of our Vision Zero commitment that was made by our city council. That happened in September 2017 and set a a 10-year goal of eliminating traffic deaths and severe injuries on our streets. So by 2027, we recognized right away that safe speeds is a critical element to reaching Vision Zero. And when the council adopted our Vision Zero commitment, they also added local control of getting local control of speed limits to the city's legislative platform. Up until that time, for folks, I think probably most people on here, or a lot of people here, are from Minnesota, but maybe some neighboring states as well. We in Minnesota, there's the speed limit set statutorily traditionally, and we had to get that changed if we were going to be able to look at lower speed limits. So we started that process. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But then last May, so about a year ago, legislation was adopted and then signed that gave all cities in Minnesota the authority to set speed limits. And we began evaluating what we would use that authority to do. And St. Paul also did as well. And we were working together in partnership on that really over the last year, both in the evaluation stage and now in implementation stage. So you can see here that we both made some ordinance changes, which we'll talk about too. We finalized our technical analysis just a few months ago. And then we announced our speed limit changes in March and are in the process of implementing them. Randy, you want to move on to the next slide, please? So as I mentioned, there is new speed limit law in Minnesota that gives all cities the authority to set local speed limits. I would note that initially the proposal of the city of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and also working in partnership with the city of Rochester, was focused on larger cities, but through the legislative process, that was expanded to include all cities in the state. I will also note that there were I'll just be upfront about it. Through that process, there was some opposition from some in the engineering community, and there were some positions taken against having that authority. MnDOT was always generally neutral through the process. They have up to this point had the sole authority for setting speed limits other than statutory speed limit including on local roads. So just a little bit on the legislative background. If people have a lot of questions there, we can certainly answer them. But from a technical standpoint, you can see that that legislation notes that cities must set speed limits in a consistent and understandable manner. They must be based on the city's safety, engineering, and traffic analysis. We must provide appropriate signage. We'll talk about that detail a little bit more later because the legislation says appropriate signage. It doesn't say what that necessarily has to be. And then we have to consider methods to communicate it to the public. And so I will note within this law, it's specific that speed limits on county and MnDOT roads stay with MnDOT. So the cities do not have authority over those. Next slide, Randy. So when there was the new state law giving cities the authority to set speed limits, there isn't sort of within that a clarity on who has the responsibility within a city enterprise to do that change. So I think if you're thinking about this in your city, one of the things you do need to think about, and we thought about, is how does your local ordinance support it? So both Minneapolis and St. Paul, we worked together on this part as well. We initially adopted a really process-oriented ordinance. Both cities did late last year that gives the authority to setting speed limits to the city engineer. It was important for us because we wanted to make sure we were following through on the legislative intent that this be a technically driven process, not a politically driven process. And so other cities can do it differently. Neither Minneapolis or St. Paul were the first cities in Minnesota to lower speed limits. That was actually Nevis, which did so last August. And so our initial ordinance change did not specify new speed limits. Both cities are still considering whether we will add in the underlying speed limit in a future ordinance change, but haven't done that yet. Next slide, Randy. So we also looked together, given that we have similar policies, we wanted to set goals together on really how do we approach the speed limit work. I think this is really important because you want your speed limit work to be grounded in your city's local policy and goals. And so we wanted to be upfront about what are we trying to achieve with our speed limit change. With that, we both have very similar goals, but a big part of that is we recognize, given the legislative approach, but also that we are at the front end of speed limit changes in recent times in the Midwest and certainly in Minnesota. We wanted it to be defensible and replicable. So not necessarily means that every city is going to have the exact same end that we do, but we wanted a process and a technical evaluation that was defensible and replicable. So we also wanted to make sure that we were supporting our safety goals. We were supporting our complete streets goals, as Randy mentioned, to support walking and biking and transit. And we also have city goals around movement of people and goods, and we wanted to recognize those too. And then fundamentally, we also wanted something that was consistent, understandable, reasonable, and appropriate for urban context. We know that speed limits can't be effective if it feels arbitrary, if it's just totally unreasonable for somebody to go that speed. So that was also a part of our goals and a part of our evaluation. All right, Randy, I think I'm kicking it back to you.
Thanks, Ethan. And maybe I'll just want to tag on to two things Ethan said. I just kind of want to reinforce. One is the replicable piece of this, the defensible and replicable, is that was very important, I think, to both cities. And I think knowing that we were sort of the first out of the gate for Minnesota, and knowing how this might affect our surrounding communities, knowing just producing something that those communities can use and build on was important to us. And I really do believe we achieved that goal. Not suggesting that other cities would come to the same conclusions we did, but I think the process we followed is definitely something that other cities can utilize. And then the second part of this is just early on in the process, and I just kind of touched on this. I should have touched on this right off the bat, but kind of the partnership here between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think at the very beginning here, both cities acknowledge the importance of sort of coming to consistent decisions on the speed limit process, given both of our sizes, how we're located, and sort of how we're both sort of part of the urban metro area. We thought it was very important that we had very similar recommendations and signage plans, and that is something that we're continuing to work on as we move forward. So the first thing I want to talk about next is sort of what our process and work plan was. I shared this. This is actually a fairly detailed thing here, but we in St. Paul created this really right when the legislation was passed to kind of figure out what our work plan was. And what I want to touch on is just how in-depth this process was, and kind of how it touched in from multiple different areas within St. Paul. And I believe Minneapolis kind of followed this in a lot of ways, the same ways. But we had an internal sort of technical working group that really worked through the technical details. A lot of work went in there from a lot of different staff. We had interdepartmental coordination, so there was coordination with us that was internal to Public Works, but also reaching outside of Public Works, our city attorney's office, our police department, our communication folks, our different departments within Public Works that would be most impacted by any changes with street design and traffic operations. It was also important that we really bring our policymakers along through the process. I certainly was not interested in getting to the end of this and not having policymaker buy-in. So there was conversations at the beginning and throughout to make sure that when it was time for the city council to act and we made recommendations that they were supportive of what we were doing. And I do believe we accomplished that. Interagency coordination, I kind of touched on this, but clearly our coordination with Minneapolis was first and foremost. But really, when we do anything, we really have multiple partners in this. We've had multiple conversations with MnDOT and the counties. One of the things that St. Paul still kind of needs to do is we still need to work with some of our bordering cities. But again, there was a lot of coordination with folks from MnDOT and the county, and I know some of them are on this call, and we appreciate your help through the process. And then the last part is the communication piece of this. And Ethan will touch on this a little bit later, but two things with this. One is that in order to really communicate changes to the public, we knew it was going to be important to have a public communications plan. And also there would be a lost opportunity in kind of meeting our ultimate goals, not to with a change in speed limits to really make a public information campaign with it. So with that, I'm going to get into the details of our technical evaluation and just kind of a high level piece here, but we did we looked at sort of national guidance, some just safety research. We did look at what some other cities have recently done. We had both a safety analysis and speed study that were specific to both Minneapolis and St. Paul, and then just bringing in what our roadway character means to the discussion. The first part of this is sort of that national research and sort of what the existing approach is. A couple of things really guide us today in regards to setting speed limits. The first is that statutory urban speed limit is 30 miles an hour. Just note that this has been a point of contention as a reason why I think both Minneapolis and St. Paul have been pushing for changes in the speed limit guidance. Most of our neighboring states, actually the majority of states in the United States, have statutory urban speed limits of 45 miles an hour. So Minnesota is a little bit of an outlier. I believe it's about a third have 30 mile an hour speed limits, and 2/3 have 25 with a couple outliers in there. The second thing here is the MUTCD. Right now, the guidance in MUTCD requires an engineering study. And it really kind of puts the 85th percentile as a higher bar than the other factors that folks should consider. So it's not a shall condition, but it's a should condition within the MUTCD that using the 85th percentile speed. And then there's a may, or the lowest sort of consideration in the MUT for other factors. As we get into this, there is a sort of a growing trend nationally to sort of look at things differently. And so the next couple slides touch on a couple of these things. But there's a 2017 report from National Transportation Safety Board that starts to touch on some of these issues with the way the MUT is requiring speeds to be set. First is that the 85th percentile does not necessarily equate to the lowest crash involvement rate for all road types. I think that kind of specifically gets to our urban road types. Secondly, that there is a sort of a growing trend of a safe systems approach to setting speed limits that really focuses on the human piece of this. The last is that that study did recommend changes to the MUTCD language. And that leads to the sort of the guidance that's coming out of the National Committee on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. So a couple things here with this. They have been talking about and considering changes. I don't think those have been adopted yet, but those are in the process. And really what this is doing is it's kind of flipping that guidance that was there before. As I mentioned in the previous slides, the other factors that should be considered were may conditions. They're now being raised to should conditions. And then really the 85th percentile guidance, really kind of taking that out of the guidance for more urban roadways. Still a viable, important piece of our freeways, expressways, and rural highways, but not as much on our urban system. NACTO has also been doing a lot of work in this regards, and actually I think Ethan has been a part of this, and I'll ask him to kind of share his thoughts here in a second. But NACTO has been working on speed limit guidance for a while, and I think we've been expecting it to release since early part of this year, and I think we're still awaiting that. Hopefully that will come out soon. But the draft guidance was available to us. It is something that we documented in our reports. But NACTO kind of developed 4 potential approaches. One was to look at citywide default speed limits at 25. Another was to sort of set category speed limits where minor streets would be 20 and major streets would be 25. A third approach was to be looking at slow zones in specific areas of your city. And the last was really to do speed limits on an individual corridor approach. Ethan, is there anything you want to share in regard to your involvement with that work?
Yeah, the couple other things that I would just note around this. So clearly folks probably know that NACTO is focused on the larger cities, but I think a lot of what you're going to find in this guidance when it comes out is going to be applicable to a variety of cities. And so I would encourage people to check it out when it does come out. It was going to be released in March, and actually I was going to be on a webinar in late March with some Seattle folks about it. But that has been delayed because of COVID-19. I have not heard an updated timeline, but I know that the draft is finished and it's just pending kind of their ability to feel comfortable releasing it with everything else going on. So just a note that this will be coming very soon.
The next piece here is for the safety research. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but obviously the speeds increase, the risk of pedestrian increases, stop and sight distance is obviously more with higher speeds. And then the other piece of safety research is Boston was one city that didn't lower the speed limits. And one of the studies that came out from Boston did show that lowering speed limits they thought was an effective countermeasure. And probably one of the interesting things that came out of that study was that what's kind of been seen is that particularly the higher end speed limits, so maybe not so much your average or 85th percentile, but your sort of outlier speeds definitely have seen a decrease as speed limits are reduced. And then lessons from other cities. This was something, there's been a few other cities that have made changes here in the recent past. And both cities, I think, took the effort to actually reach out directly to these cities and gather information from them. One interesting tidbit I'd share from this, and what we learned through our evaluation, is that the legislation that was passed in Minnesota gave us options that none of the other cities had. In New York, it was basically they were given the choice to lower their default speed limit. That was the choice they were given. Portland and Seattle were given the option to lower speeds on their residential roads. The legislation in Minnesota is a little bit broader and gives us a little bit, really kind of the ability to do something a little different than either of those cities did. I think what I'd share is that New York did a full lowering of their speeds to 25, and almost most of their roadways in New York now are 25, with just a few outliers. Both Portland and Seattle really they changed their residential roadways to 20 miles an hour and are looking at their arterial collectors on a more case-by-case basis. And then there's a graphic here in terms of some initial data that has come in from Seattle that is very promising in terms of what they're seeing from a reduction in total crashes with their speed limit changes, as well as also some promising results from speeding. And again, you see the reduction in the top end speeders. So there's a 20% reduction in top end speeders, or folks going 10 plus over the speed limit. Ethan, do you want to share any more from what you guys took out of sort of that peer city research?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, there are other cities as well that have recently changed speed limits. Some of those include Charlotte, North Carolina, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Boston was mentioned, Cambridge, Massachusetts. There are still, that said, there are still relatively few cities that have done it that are similar sort of size to St. Paul and Minneapolis in, say, the last 5 to 10 years. So we were able to, choose from the ones that had done it most comprehensively. But as Randy said, not exactly an apples to apples, but we were still able to learn a lot from them. The one thing I would add to the Seattle data in particular is that Seattle released some first initial parts of their detailed evaluation late last year, which I don't think it's available fully online yet, but I know that they're finishing up a detailed evaluation that will be public soon. But based on their initial evaluation, they had initially lowered all of their non-arterial streets from 25 to 20, and then their arterial streets, they did downtown and then some other streets from 30 to 25. Based on their initial evaluation of the arterial changes, they expanded lowering arterial speed limits to nearly all of their arterial network last fall. So, or late last year, I should say. So based on their evaluation, they expanded that, and that was, I think, good to have that real data.
I just want to briefly here touch on sort of the characteristics of urban road, and I think part of this is acknowledging the decisions that Minneapolis and St. Paul made do not necessarily fit what our neighboring cities would or should make. That's a decision for each of those cities to make. But a couple of characteristics I think we are specific to an urban environment. There's a picture here that shows kind of more of a typical residential street, or that has fairly narrow two-way driving area because of the parked vehicles. So a lot of parking, sort of more narrow through lanes for traffic. The other slide here just shows the number of pedestrians. This is more of a downtown environment, but just throughout our network, there is a lot of pedestrians. My previous position was in the city of Eden Prairie, and one of the things that we worked on there was, when we looked at crosswalks, actually meeting IT guidance of 20 heads an hour is something I really don't believe exists in more than a handful of locations in the entire city. In St. Paul, there are hundreds and hundreds that would meet that criteria. It just goes to kind of speak the difference between, again, that urban suburban environment. The last one here is just, again, it kind of shows just the different things that are going on within a city environment. The spacing of our intersections, the traffic control of our intersections, the multimodal element of most of our roadways. So again, it's just a lot of different things are going on our roadways in a much more confined space. The next step here is sort of our safety evaluation. So both cities, as part of this, sort of compiled, kind of in part due to this effort, but in other efforts had done, different safety studies. Through our process, we were actually working on a bike safety study at the same time that we were doing our evaluation. And a couple of key findings here. I don't think these would surprise anyone. And I think they're fairly similar for both Minneapolis and St. Paul. But essentially, non-motorized vehicles were involved in only 3% of the total crashes, but 33% of them were serious. It just speaks to the vulnerability of those users, that when they get in accidents, they tend to be much more severe. The second thing is that crashes are concentrated in our higher traffic collector and arterial streets. This is in some sense a function of the exposure, but I think it's also just the amount of things that are going on those streets. So our data shows that 91% of our severe crashes is on 21% of our mileage. So again, that's fairly significant concentration and speaks to the importance of how we treat safety along our arterial and collector roadways. I do think, essentially Minneapolis's findings mirrored ours. Ethan, is there anything you want to share on that?
Yes, those the two that Randy mentioned also we found in Minneapolis, and then we also were able to do a bit more detailed analysis. Actually, one of the slides flowing at the beginning was Kinley Horn worked with us on some traffic analysis, and part of that they looked at speed and found that streets with higher speed limits, we had some variety in the city beforehand, were more likely to have more crashes, and a higher percentage of crashes were severe and fatal, especially for pedestrians. So that sort of, just aligns with the national research. And we also saw that speeding in particular was a top 5 behavior that was leading to severe and fatal crashes.
So the next part here is both cities did actually quite a bit of speed work. Minneapolis in 2018 did a bunch of radar counts. So radar counts at 448 locations, which were over 11,000 individual readings, resulting in what they determined was to be 22 mile an hour median speed on local roads and 27 on arterial and collectors. St. Paul, we did a little bit different, partly given the time crunch we were in and our ability to actually go out and do individual counts. What we did was we basically went back through our data and really compiled 5 years worth of speed counts that we had within our database. Because we weren't sure if there was any bias built into that, we also did an additional about 75 locations this past fall to just see if there was any difference between sort of the bigger data set we had and one that was a little bit more random in selection. Our data, just the way we had to calculate that data, it's a little bit different, but our results were very similar in regards to, again, the way I'm reading this is a little bit, I get confused every time I do this, but we have a 25 mile an hour median speed for our 50th percentile and 28 mile-an-hour median speed for our 50th percentile on collector and arterials. With that, it kind of leads to some of our conclusions, our primary conclusions that we had, and kind of which drove us to our decision. I think one is lower traffic speeds reduce both the likelihood of crashes, and those crashes will be severe or fatal. Traditional approach of the 85th percentile speed is no longer considered the best practice for urban streets. When we're setting urban speed limits, really there are kind of two common options that are emerging. One is the default speed limit of 25 miles an hour, and the other is a category speed limits with minor streets at 20 and more major streets at 25. And then the last thing is, I think as we went through this, is that a citywide speed limit of 25, we did not think best reflected in design use and mode use of our roadways. And really that kind of comes to that 74% of our roadways, I'm guessing Minneapolis's number is pretty similar here, are minor streets. And that's probably the case in most communities where our residential streets are really the highest number of our streets. And there's a different character to them than there are our arterial and collectors. Ultimately, that led both cities to a recommendation of using that category approach of our tiered system with 20 miles an hour for our local residential streets and 25 for our city-owned collector and arterials. Each city has a few major streets that will have speed limits higher than 25 miles an hour. And I think there's studies ongoing on some of those. We're actually making some changes to Hyde Mill in St. Paul and are looking at that roadway right now to determine what the appropriate speed is for that roadway. And also just kind of reinforce that this action has nothing to do with the county and MnDOT roads, as we do not have the authority to change the speed limits on county or state roads. A little thing pop up, what was that meant for me? I'll keep. Was there a comment there, Morgan?
It may have just been in the chat. Some people have added some questions in, so we can save those to the end, and I can help facilitate the questions at the end. And if anyone else has questions, feel free to type them in the chat, and we can go through them at the end of the presentation.
Thanks, Morgan. In regards to implementation, the signing piece of this is a huge piece and a huge effort. And it was something that we actually did sort of look at as we were considering our options, because we wanted to make sure that whatever recommendation we came out with, that we were confident we could actually sign consistent with state statute. And so throwing a couple things up here, but the graphic here is just a snapshot of St. Paul and sort of how we were looking at this. The blue tick marks in there are sort of the 25 mile an hour signs that would need to be placed on all the arterial and collector roadways. Going with our tiered system means that essentially all of our arterial and collectors need to be signed and consigned consistently throughout the city. So that is what those blue tick marks on there. The second thing is looking at gateway signage. And so that's what the red marks are on here. So it really kind of all the key entry points into the city or ways that people would enter the city off the freeway. Those locations will need to be signed with a gateway sign indicating what the citywide speed limit is. And then as we look at this, for St. Paul, and I can tell you, I know these numbers are low as we've started to sort of do our implementation, but sort of when we did this original analysis, we were thinking that we were on order of 600 plus 25 mile hour signs that we'd have to put up in the city and 150 plus gateway signs. So over 750 signs. I believe Minneapolis is roughly double us. So a fairly significant number of signs, extensive effort to make happen. So a couple things with that. One is this does not happen overnight. Both cities basically I think Minneapolis started in mid-March. St. Paul started in early April, and we expect this to really take most of the summer. Early returns it's going faster than we thought, but it is still taking, it's a minimum of 3 or 4 month process, and it could easily stretch into late fall on this. And the second part of this is we continue to coordinate with Minneapolis on this. We kind of kicked this off at the same time in mid-March. And then as we move forward, once we start putting up the gateway signs, we see that as another sort of collaboration point. And we plan to sort of start installation of our gateway signs at the same time and support that with some media coverage and a communications plan. Our implementation doesn't stop with signing. Another key piece of this is signals. We actually, two kind of efforts are being undertaken by both cities. One is we are looking at our traffic clearance times, so our yellow and all red times. On most of our signals, in fact, in St. Paul, we're just using an opportunity to review our clearance time, all of our clearance times on all of our signals. And then also looking at updating coordination on a number of corridors. I know Minneapolis has a pretty significant effort on the coordination piece. In St. Paul, it's not quite as significant as Minneapolis, but there are definitely some corridors we'll be doing some signal coordination updates. Here's just a map showing the before and after speed limits for St. Paul. The one in the upper part is the before and the bottom part's the after. Basically, the gray lines on both, the gray lines on the top one are the 30 mile an hour, and you see how significant basically the entire city was 30 miles an hour. After the speed limits definitely are big change. The yellow markings on there are the 25, and most of the gray ones are 30. And then we're going to have the MnDOT and county roads that are the black lines in there that are 30. So we are adding some variability in our speed limits with this change. With that, I will turn it back to Ethan.
Yeah, and here's the before and after map in Minneapolis. So again, you just see the sort of the significance of the change, but as in St. Paul, you see the county and MnDOT roads still standing out as sort of different. I'll note that we didn't start with a uniform across the board speed limit in the city. Most streets were 30, but there was also variation when we started this, and so there continues to be some variation afterwards. Next slide, Randy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our communications efforts here. So overall, we know from our conversations with other cities that getting out the word about new speed limits is really important, and doing that in a variety of ways that build off of our signage plan. And so both cities said to maximize our ability to get out the word, we wanted to work in partnership. So you can see like on this graphic here, which is something that we're using in a variety of different ways: stickers, postcards, yard signs for community members, graphics for social media. We have a few other graphics as well, but generally we're slower and safer. Slower is safer is our key tagline. And then we are focusing a lot on the 20 is plenty, because as Randy went over, we're not signing every local residential street. And so we know getting out the word on that is extra important. But you can see on this graphic that everything is co-branded for the city of both cities, and all of our we had a joint press event to share what the new speed limits would be, and that was all coordinated together. Our timeline on everything has been together. All of our materials are the same, and the same messaging and align. We have a few things that are a little bit different, just and more in like the frequently asked questions level of detail, where things differ slightly between the two cities. But overall, we have a few different pieces. So the yard signs is a big strategy for us. It's been delayed a bit because of COVID-19, but both cities are close to announcing distribution plans to get out. Collectively, we have 5,000 yard signs that we'll be distributing. This is something that both Seattle and Portland did, and really getting at those local residential streets. But it's both a way to get out the word, but a way also to involve community members who generally are very excited, many of whom are very excited about the change and want to see lower speeds, especially in front of their house. So this gives them an opportunity to kind of share that and be a part of the process. So the fact that we've been delayed in being able to get out those yard signs, I literally get multiple requests for yard signs every day. There's a lot of demand for those, and so we're hopeful those will be successful. We're also in Minneapolis partnering with some community-based groups to do some culturally specific and focused outreach to make sure we're getting out the word both in language, so recognizing our key different cultural communities that speak languages other than English, but also in culture, so that we have culturally specific messages and also people who are messengers for that. And then we're using both cities are using a variety of our city communications channels, as well as paid social ads will be coming, and eventually, whether it's next year or whenever it will be, we will incorporate this into more outreach at events and other things. Media is a big part of this too. So we actually, unfortunately, announced our changes. I think it was the day before the emergency order was for COVID-19. So we were in one way lucky that our press event was sort of the last press event the city did in a normal way. I think both cities. But also unlucky in that we didn't get the media attention that we would have otherwise. And so Randy spoke to that we're going to be using other future opportunities to really capitalize on the media interest in this. And you know, that's a big deal too for getting out the word. Next slide, Randy. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about enforcement too. So both cities, both cities, I think, approach this slightly differently. And in Minneapolis, enforcement conversations are complicated because of some distrust especially from communities of color around policing and traffic enforcement in particular. And so that is something that we've recognized throughout our Vision Zero efforts in Minneapolis. And we had to think about very intentionally around our speed limit effort as well. Now, we also hear from many community members that they want us to do more enforcement. One of the things that we heard most when this was, we put this out in our draft Vision Zero action plan, that we would be lowering speed limits, is people said, well, without enforcement, it's not going to be meaningful. Now, that's not actually what we found in our research of other cities, because most of the cities that Randy went through earlier, other than New York, none of them had an increased focus on enforcement after their speed limits were lowered. They were focused really on the signage education, helping people understand why we're working on this, the importance of speed for safety, which, you know, frankly, we doesn't maybe get as much attention as other things like distracted driving or drunk driving do, but is really important as well. And so I would note that. So in Minneapolis, this is actually, both cities ended up with, we're going to continue to enforce speed limits. Obviously, the new speed limits, you know, that'll be, the officers will have, you know, whether that enforcement would start is a little bit lower. But neither city is putting extra. I believe that's true, Randy, correct me if I'm wrong, that St. Paul's changed their approach, but continuing more, we will continue to enforce the laws as we have been. And, you know, recognizing that in Minneapolis, at least, you know, that's maybe lower than some community members want and has more disparate impacts than other community members want. And so for the future, especially in Minneapolis, we have, as part of our Vision Zero action plan, really trying to figure out automated traffic enforcement in Minnesota, which requires, to do it well, requires a change in state law. And so that's something that we're going to be doing more work on and engaging more communities around in the future, studying more technically how it would work. For folks who maybe wonder, wasn't there a program in Minneapolis that the Supreme Court overturned? Yes, there was a red light camera program briefly in the city of Minneapolis in 2005. The Supreme Court did overturn it, but not because they said it was unconstitutional, but because they said we didn't have the legislative authority to do it the way that we were doing it. And so that's going to take is a multi-year process, but most of these other cities have automated enforcement among other strategies that they're using around speeds and safe speeds. Next slide, Randy.
Hold on.
Also want to note in Minneapolis that we recognize that, in addition to education enforcement, like the speed limit a speed limit change is sort of the basis from which we build and achieve safe speeds. And a big part of that is street design. And so through our evaluation, we certainly determined, as Randy said, with kind of the existing speeds, that our streets in a lot of ways are supporting speeds close to what our new speed limits are at. But we are looking at within Minneapolis, making sure that as we update a document we call our street design guide, that we are using the speed limit as our target operating speed and our design speed on our roadways. So as part of that, we're considering different things that would support then slower speeds, and recognizing that we do need to get slower speeds, both from a safety perspective, but also to align with our speed limits. And so we are looking at some narrower lane widths, potentially some raised crossings, to help us, in a variety of ways, especially with turning speeds, traffic circles, chicanes, some other things as well. We also recognize that with this change, we are getting more community requests for traffic calming. So before, we got a lot of community requests for traffic calming, thousands a year, and we're getting even more now because people say, hey, the speed limit's lowering, you should do more traffic calming, the speed's too high on my street. And so we are in the process of updating our neighborhood traffic calming procedures, and we'll have those in place by the end of the year. We were really intentional in Minneapolis ahead of time to sort of have some of the answers ready for the questions that we knew were going to come, which include, can I get traffic calming on my street? Can I get a speed limit sign on my street? And I don't like the speed limit you chose for my street. And so we wanted to be ready for those questions, which have come, but actually, frankly, haven't come as much as maybe we expected, but still have increased. And we have answers for all those things, which is basically, we're going to be doing evaluation. We'll talk about this in just a second, but we're not going to be considering adding additional signs or changing speed limits on individual streets until we have a chance to evaluate how did this change go. This is a good segue. Randy, next one. So evaluation. We're both kind of looking at this in a similar way. Again, in Minneapolis, we did a study, as was Randy mentioned, of speeds in 2018. We plan to just repeat that exact same study, same locations, same time of year, day, et cetera, so we can get as comparable data as possible. Now, we're going to want that we have that plan for next year. We'll probably keep an eye on it with COVID-19. Still, where does that things land? But our plan is next summer. And then we're also going to be looking at crash analysis over 2 years initially. Randy, I know in Randy and St. Paul, it's a sort of a similar approach, but do you want to add anything here?
So a similar approach. I think the one thing I would share, and I think this is somewhat the same with Minneapolis, is that partly I think we both want to take a little bit of a wait and see with this. We're making a pretty big change, and different folks are going to react differently. And I know that kind of my point here is I think we really want to we're making this change. We want to see how it works, and we want to give ourselves like a year before we make any substantial changes in regards to reconsidering any sort of speed limits or doing an evaluation, just because we kind of need to see how this plays out and how people react to it.
Yeah, I should also maybe at this point just acknowledge that MnDOT is leading a study around speed limits statewide as well, and I think it's going to be less in the evaluation and kind of the traditional like before after sense, but certainly pulling things together. Randy, do you want to mention anything about that for this group?
Yeah, so it's I should know better. I'm actually on the group, but it's what they're really doing, and they're not looking at evaluating speed limits. They're really looking at how Minnesota wants to or should be approaching speed limits and their management of speed limits. So it's not no recommendations will come out of that study in regards to what appropriate speed limits are. It's more what should Minnesota's approach to speed limits be moving into the future. And that's really kind of the main goal of the study.
Thanks. And then next one. So we do both of our speed limits evaluations are available online in their entirety. Both documents I think are 30+ pages with a lot of detailed information. You can find them at these websites. And I think with that, we're going to transition into the Q&A section. So thank you all.
Thank you guys so much for your presentation. A few questions did come in. Just scrolling up to see the first one. This one's from Scott Pasca. Can either of you speak to one of the keys to traffic safety enforcement and the added emphasis to enforce the new posted speed limits? I think you already touched on this a little bit. This one came in before you mentioned it, so anything else you'd want to add to that?
I guess maybe one thing I would add additionally is in Minneapolis, we also are in the process of, we're about to have a traffic enforcement working group made up of both internal staff, but also community members from a variety of perspectives that will be kicking off soon. That piece was at direction of the city council. And so, as I mentioned, like the speed enforcement part is very much tied up in those broader community conversations about traffic enforcement, effectiveness of traffic enforcement, capacity for traffic enforcement, because we don't have a dedicated traffic enforcement unit in Minneapolis, but also equity around traffic enforcement. And for all of those things to come together and work well for speed management, for us in Minneapolis, we have to address all of those things and be building community trust along the way.
Thank you. One more, which I think is very similar. I don't know if you have anything else to add from, I can't read the name from this username, but during the process, were there any discussions about social justice implications of reducing the speed? The data suggests that the busiest roads have over 50% of drivers breaking the law. I think that's kind of what you just touched on. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so a couple, I think, additional things. So in Minneapolis, we didn't include it in these slides, but it's part of our evaluation and part of our Vision Zero action plan generally is we found that crashes and severe and fatal crashes are disproportionately concentrated in low-income neighborhoods and neighborhoods where a majority of residents are people of color. And so we have inequities in how traffic crashes impact our communities today. With our Vision Zero effort overall, equity is a central core principle and key part of our work, both from a recognition that we need to, that those disparities in how traffic crashes impact communities are unacceptable, and we need to change those. But we also have to be mindful along the way that we aren't creating inadvertent negative impacts on communities as well and inequitable. And so when we think about things like traffic enforcement around new speed limit change, for example, that's one where equity comes into play big time. But additionally, as we talked about our communications plan, we were really intentional within that. We had to have outreach that was culturally specific, that was in language, that was in partnership with community-based organizations as well. So it isn't just solely top-down through traditional methods, but they were also doing other ways to reach and connecting people. And recognizing that the reality is that we see from an education standpoint is that many of our community members never get driver's education because they don't go through driver's education in high school. They wait until after high school, after they turn 18, to seek a driver's license. And by then, they aren't required to have driver's education. And so you had, and that's especially true for folks with lower incomes. And so we have to be extra aware of, how are we getting out the word and recognizing the different barriers that exist for people. Randy, I don't know if you have anything you want to add from St. Paul's perspective on that.
No, I can't top that.
Thanks. For those of you who do have additional questions, I'm reading these questions from the chat window. It should be at the bottom of your screen, or if you see the triple dots, you can open a chat window. And if you send a chat either to everyone or privately to me, I can include that in the question section now. The next question comes from, I believe, Scott McBride. Does this extraordinary level of cooperation between the two cities mean that the friendly rivalry is over once and for all, and it's now safe to cross the border?
Scott has to stay in St. Paul. It's a part-time thing, and Scott has to remain in St. Paul.
I will say that when I first joined the city about a year and a half ago, I met pretty soon with some planners in St. Paul, and we were talking about potential partnership things we could do together, and recognized that we didn't very often work together in partnership, kind of, which was sort of surprising. And we immediately kind of identified that speed limits might be one of those things, and it really has worked out very well. And that continues in a very strong way. We're still having regular conversations on the communication side with both cities. And so I think a lot of the people, even outside of public works, are saying, wow, we haven't engaged this much together, and this is really helpful, and we should do this again.
And I would share, just as to Ethan's point, this has continued into our shared space work. Minneapolis reached out to St. Paul not too long ago, and some of the pedestrian closures we have along the river roads and across the bridges was a shared initiative between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the Minneapolis Park Board, and that's ongoing right now.
Awesome. We have a note here from Gary Davis. I don't know if you guys wanted to comment on it, but he says the UMN is planning a before and after study evaluation of the speed limit changes, and offers his contact information for those cities that are interested in participating. I don't know if you guys had any comments on that.
We'd love to talk to Gary and get his thoughts and partner with him.
Ditto.
One more question just came in. Will people be allowed to have a 20? Will people be allowed to have a 20 miles per hour speed limit? 20 is plenty sign if they're located on a road that's 25 or 30 miles per hour.
Yeah, so if that's speaking to those yard signs, 20 is plenty, slower is safer. We are going to just be sharing those with community members. We expect from experiences in Portland and Seattle that those will primarily end up with on 20-mile-an-hour roads. Probably not exclusively, but frankly, slower is safer, kind of no matter what the road is. And so, yeah, we're not policing where those go.
And I'd say I agree to that. And I think just the whole idea of the gateway sign, having that message on those different roads, I don't know if we see as it being a bad thing. The part of this is to make sure that people traveling in our cities understand that the sort of the citywide speed limit is 20, and that they should know that regardless of whether or not they're traveling on a road that's posted, for something higher than 20.
Awesome. A question here from Todd Foster. So we are lowering speeds. Then after the huge cost of all the new signs, we add the automated enforcement and redesigned streets at what cost? It seems like the tail wagging the dog. 50 percentile speeds in this presentation were 28 miles per hour. Guessing the 85th percentile is 30 miles per hour.
That's a fair question. I think, part of this is that I think this is a little bit the chicken and egg. For those of us that work in the urban environment, and I think anywhere, we constantly get complaints about speed and speeding. And I think, we never had the authority to address it before in terms of the direct authority. We were really at the mercy of others. And we now have that authority to do that. This is an action that we can take. And until we take this action and really start designing roads in a different way, we don't know what we're going to get from a speed standpoint. But the status quo was not acceptable in our communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So in Minneapolis, and over the last few years, we have an average of 140 severe fatal crashes on our streets, and our goal is 0. That's a lot of work. To get to 0 from 140 a year. Those are 140 individual people and families whose lives are forever changed. In my position, I end up talking with quite a few of the family members that are impacted by this. And speed is a big factor in nearly all of those severe and fatal crashes. For both of our cities, that's unacceptable. That impact on our communities and our community members. And so that was really driving this. I would also note that in a lot of cases, when I talked about future street design changes, we are certainly looking at both proactive things that we would do within Vision Zero to improve safety on our high injury streets and otherwise on our neighborhood streets as well. But a lot of those changes will come as streets are reconstructed when there isn't a cost differential, and we can do it in the way that we want to serve our community best at that time. But also traditionally, so we very much, I think we have streets that were built for a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, and so in a lot of ways, and then I think an 85th percentile approach, we often end up with reality that community members will say, hey, they're speeding on this street, we want you to lower the speed limit. And then with an 85th percentile approach, we go out and we do it, and we actually might end up raising the speed limit. So I know in the city of Minneapolis for many years, we were always very hesitant to seek a speed study even, especially where there were on the busier roads where we had a lot of complaints about speeding because of that kind of reverse of that. And then, design is reinforcing higher speeds, the speed limit gets raised, and then future designs reinforce that higher speed. And so that's, we're kind of changing that system in a different way with safety as the focus.
Another question. I've heard that a good portion of the people who are speeding through neighborhoods are the ones who live there. Have you found this to be true?
I can jump in. I don't know if we have, that's something that it's, hard to specifically determine, but certainly in my career, I think when you see speeding in neighborhoods, that often it is the folks that live there. That said, all of our streets are different. Some streets are primarily serving the people that live there, and other streets serve a broader group. But certainly, yeah, I think in general that when we get speeding complaints, it's certainly very possible that the same people that are complaining are the same people that are speeding. And I think this kind of goes to that the change we're talking about somewhat is I think we're trying to push a little bit of a culture shift. People get in their cars and they don't necessarily realize what speed they're going. And it feels a lot different when you're a pedestrian on the street versus when you're in the safety of your car. And part of this and part of the communication with what we're trying to do is, start that culture shift and make people more cognizant of the speed and the speeds they're traveling, and try to make ideally get better compliance with our speed laws.
Another question. Has Metro Transit changed its route schedules due to slower total trip time?
So one is I saw that pop up, and one thing is that was another agency that we did coordinate with and have some communication with. One of the criteria in terms of selecting the appropriate speed on our roads was Metro Transit bus routes. So that was actually a criteria to say that would be a 25-mile-an-hour speed versus a 20. Ethan can probably touch on that a little bit more. I know there's a few locations in St. Paul where there is definitely bus routes that would be on 20-mile-an-hour roads, but they tend to be a shorter duration in terms of the amount of the route that's actually on a 20-mile-an-hour roadway, and certainly they tend to be lower frequency routes. So we did talk to Metro Transit. I think a lot of their riders tend to be walkers and bikers as well. So I think they're supportive of it, but it's something I know they're going to have to respond to and work on moving forward. Have not heard anything in terms of changes they're actually making.
That very much aligns with our approach and what we our coordination with Metro Transit in Minneapolis as well.
Awesome. Another question here from Rod. I'm not sure if you fully typed it. Is the quality, or was the recommended speed limits on? Oh, here we go. Did the quality or existence of PED facilities have an impact on the recommended speed limit?
I think our two cities actually took a slightly different approach on this question. I can start from Minneapolis. It was part of our criteria. We actually, most of our streets have sidewalks. Most of our streets have sidewalks on both sides. And then you can get more fine-tuned than that for sure. But one of our criteria is if we had a street where there were local land uses, and no sidewalk, then that would push the street to 20 miles an hour, because it meant that people would be inherently having to walk in the street from time to time. So that's how we approached it in Minneapolis.
In St. Paul, I think the answer is we didn't use that as a factor, partly because we do have sidewalk gaps, so we're actively trying to address those, and we didn't think it was appropriate, given sort of the number of sidewalk gaps that we have and some of the character of the roadways, that we would necessarily make a speed limit decision specifically on that issue. But we are actively working to fill those gaps in our network.
Question about the PowerPoint being available. It will be available after the presentation, and this is being recorded and will be available on the NCITE YouTube page after this session. I think that's the end of the questions we had in the chat box, unless anyone else has any questions they're typing in as we speak. And then, unless I missed any, if I missed any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and share your question. Right.
Randy, it's Todd Foster again. I mean, I hear you guys talking about speeding being the issue, and you mentioned culture shift, and I just don't know. I guess I'm not convinced that a culture shift in lowering speed limits creates fewer speeders or more safety or fewer fatalities and things like that. I hear what you guys are doing. I think your intentions are good, but I'm just not convinced. And I made an analogy earlier. City of Bloomington had no basket weave signs on residential streets, and City of Minneapolis and St. Paul did. And Bloomington had lower incident of crashes in those residential intersections than St. Paul and Minneapolis. So putting up signs doesn't necessarily solve maybe the goal. You know what I mean? If you guys could speak to that,
Yep, Todd, thanks. And again, I don't disagree. And I think, as we looked at this, I think it's, I do think there's a culture shift piece of this, but I think, the things that we saw in the research are probably the two things I think we really hope to accomplish and are pretty confident that we can accomplish are reduction in crashes. I think the results we've seen so far appear to be promising in that. And I think that's going to be, probably the key piece of our evaluation is really what we're seeing with crashes. And the second part is the other thing that we've at least seen in that initial studies is that reduction in that sort of the top end speeds. So those people that are maybe going 10 plus over the speed limit. And again, some ways, given the way that we enforce speed limits and how people view speed limits, that is a big deal. If we can, if a road's 30 miles an hour and people are very comfortable going 40, you saw the slide we put up there in terms of the impact on the safety of pedestrians. If we can get those top end speeders to knock down their speed by 5 miles an hour or more, we are making a pretty big safety difference on our roadways. And so I'm not going to try to claim what we've done is perfect. But again, I think we're looking at those kind of probably two primary things that we do believe we can make a difference on. And as we go forward and evaluate, we'll find out. But again, I think from part of what both of our city's policy documents said is that really the status quo and the deaths that we have and the issues that we're having with pedestrian safety are not acceptable to both of our agencies.
Yeah, and I would just add, I alluded to it, or I mentioned it earlier, that speed limits for us in Minneapolis is part of our comprehensive approach to achieving lower, safer speeds. It's not going to happen instantly overnight. Speed limit change is a really important and foundational part of that. We frankly, we can't achieve it without it. Is it going to get us all the way to where we want to go on its own? No. And no single policy or action is going to get you all the way is going to get us all the way to our goals. That's why we need a multifaceted approach. The other piece is for us and for, frankly, a lot of our neighboring cities as well, our local residential streets, 30 miles an hour, no one can argue that that's an appropriate speed limit, that is consistent with the environment, is consistent with the speed profiles of those roadways, is consistent with the safety goals or expectations of community members. I don't think anyone can argue that that's the case. 75% of the streets that we're lowering the speed limits on are those local residential streets. And so we recognize the importance of addressing speed on our busier streets because that's where most of our crashes are and severe and fatal crashes. But the impact on those local residential streets is significant as well, and really aligning it much more with the expectations and use out there today.